Recording in progress.
Thank you, BJ and Ellen. That was really beautiful. Um, I'm Paisley Harris. I'm a member of Open Circle. And for those of you who may not have read the announcements, I have a background in both history and law, and we'll be talking about the separation of church and state being under fire this morning. And I'm glad to be here to talk about this with a group that has always been interested in freedom of speech and our basic freedoms and making a society better. I, I'll be discussing a little bit about how important the separation of church and state is, and then I will turn to discussing some recent, challenges and troubling developments, focusing especially on two areas: some recent Supreme Court decisions that could undermine the separation of church and state, and the rising Christian nationalist movement that rejects the importance of that altogether. And I'll end by making some suggestions of what we can do as citizens in UUs. And that's, I see we have some guests that's short for Unitarian Universalists because our full name gets to be a mouthful. But what we can do as Unitarian Universalists to help protect this important principle. And also, of course, just as people who are part of this country. I also want to acknowledge that I'm aware I'm pretty much preaching to the converted here, I would say. The Unitarian Universalist Association, even just in the church itself allows all sorts of religious and non-religious beliefs. There's Unitarian Universalists who are atheists and others who support a strong Christianity, and so on. The Unitarian Universalist Association has several times made strong statements in support of separation of church and state at important times. So I realize I don't really have to convince, I'm guessing I don't have to convince most people of this importance, but I just want to emphasize a few things about why it is important to have church and state separated. And I think on a personal level, one's religion and spirituality is something that it is so personal. It's deeply personal, and that shouldn't be mandated by any state. Religious freedom is and always has been a key to individual liberty. It's just a strong part of that freedom of expression. It's also key to the retention of a democratic government, with a small d, that if we are going to be able to pick our leaders, it's important that they're not telling us that you must be in this religion and you have to vote for, what this religion thinks and so on. And it's also important that no religion has an undue influence over a country's law and laws. And through history, many times the church has been just deeply connected with the state, with the monarchy, with the government. Looking more at history, government imposition of religion has often led to bloodshed that's killed thousands of people. Think about the Crusades. Think about during Europe's history, there were many times that there were wars over what was going to be the established church. Would it be Catholic? Would it be Protestant for different areas in Europe? Many of the colonists came to the early United States, what would become the United States, seeking religious freedom. The Puritans did that. Then they didn't let other people in Massachusetts have religious freedom. You couldn't come there if you were Catholic, but they were seeking it for themselves. On the other hand, Maryland was started as a Catholic haven. Pennsylvania was started as a haven for Quakers, and they did respect religious choice for others. They welcomed anyone. They didn't even try to convert indigenous people. They actually thought indigenous people, too, had the right to their spiritual ways. So it's not surprising that the founders of the United States developed a really deep appreciation of the separation of church and state and made it one of the fundamental principles of democracy. That specific phrase isn't found anywhere in the Constitution, but obviously those phrases of the no establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion are in there. So we're on the right slide, so that's awesome. So you can see here a couple of things that I'm going to talk about today. And I would say It's my view that the separation of church and state is more imperiled than it's been in a very long time, at least in my lifetime, which, is pretty long. Um, and it has been weakened somewhat by some recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And then I do think that the rise of Christian nationalism is quite concerning as well. Um, and I do want to mention, I think many of you here, may be very aware on a lot of these issues too. And some of you, may even know more about the rise of Christian nationalism than I do. I think it's something that just in the last couple months, people have been learning more about. So at coffee hour, I'd love to talk with you. I'm not some like great expert on this. I just know it's very important and had some things I thought would be good to share. All right. So, in terms of the Supreme Court decisions, though, in the 1940s through the 1960s and even into the 1970s, the U.S. Supreme Court came down with several decisions that greatly strengthened the wall of separation between church and state. And honestly, even though there were those great words in the Constitution, there were a lot of prayers in public schools and prayers at government events, which honestly that still happens. The prayers at public events and things like that. But I think after World War II, just with having gone through that great conflict, I think that Americans became more aware of how important their personal freedoms were. And the Supreme Court came down with a lot of rulings about the public spaces, shouldn't have religious symbols, that there shouldn't be prayers prayers where the teacher's leading the prayer in public school classrooms and so on. That the Ten Commandments should not be displayed, by teachers or by a judge in a municipal courtroom, and so on. So there were just a number of very important decisions around that. But then in the late 2010s, and particularly after the 2016 election, with the appointment of judges who were chosen for their political conservatism, for their views on the right to reproductive choice and so on, there started to be a shift. And in the 2019 case, American Legion versus American Humanist Association, they allowed the statue that's pictured on this slide. It's over towards me on that one and over towards you on that one. And I had a couple questions about this. Do you recognize what that symbol is? Anybody know what it's a cross? Yes. And do you think a cross is a religious symbol? Yes, okay. And what's it a symbol of? Which religion? Yeah, well, the Supreme Court said you were wrong about all that, at least the majority of them. They said, well, no, this is not a religious symbol here. It's a long-standing community landmark. It's at a World War I graveyard. That's true. That's it. It's this graveyard. But they said this is a long-standing landmark. It symbolizes loss in war. If we tore that down, and it's on municipal ground, if we tore that down, that would be showing hostility to religion. The dissenters, led by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the dissent, saw things differently. They said, actually, a cross is a religious symbol. And it's of the Christian religion. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was Jewish, did recognize that. And you wouldn't have to tear it down. You could see if a private entity would take that land. You could give that land to a private entity. You wouldn't have to tear down that cross to take care of this problem. So that was an example of, allowing what is pretty clearly a religious monument in public space. And there'd been quite a few cases that had said, if you're going to have a Christmas display, and you want to have a creche, you've got to have other symbols too. You should have some things that are secular. You don't want to be, making people think they all have to look at religion, look at this holiday in the same way, and so on. There were also cases about religious education and displays in public schools in the 40s through 70s until about 1980. And the Supreme Court was generally very cautious to have not to have public schools appear to be endorsing religion. And for example, they did say a public school teacher can't lead students in prayer, and that had often happened before. They can't read Bible verses. You can't have religious education as part of the public school curriculum, and so on. Just a lot of cases like that. They did allow things like letting there be public funding of students going to parochial or religious schools as well as the public schools. They said, well, that's just kind of, treating people equally, and that decision, still stands. But in 2000, after 2016, there are some signs that there might be some shifts, and there was actually a turn to having a different legal standard for looking at establishment cases. And there haven't been a lot of cases yet, but one that has come up already is a pretty famous one. Right, it's the praying coach case, and this was in 2022. It's Kennedy versus the Bremerton School District. And the Supreme Court said that the post-game public prayers of high school football coach on the 50-yard line, often joined by students, they said, well, that's just his free exercise of religion. It would be it's not an unconstitutional encouragement of students to pray by this teacher and authority figure, in a public school setting. Now the facts are a little bit different than a teacher being in a schoolroom where the kids really can't leave, and so on. But I think a high school football coach is probably a pretty persuasive person. Now, I'll admit he was not the head coach, but still he was, a charismatic coach, somebody who was well-liked. He originally did encourage students to join him, the other coaches, and said, you can't do that, but, but there's still that kind of unconscious, persuasion. There's this coach. Would they have ever thought, will he be more likely to pick me for the team, and so on. The other thing is that in this, and there was a good dissent to this case by three justices as well. But I think one of the especially important things about this case is the court chose to abandon a 50-year-old rule for how courts looked at whether an establishment of religion was happening. And it seemed to be a pretty useful standard. It was, is there some secular purpose to this? Do the effects of it advance or inhibit religion in any way? And is there any excessive entanglement with religion? Now, obviously, most of that takes some consideration and so on, but it says this is a thing you should consider, if there is some, religious symbol, or if a teacher is, maybe there'd be some lesson where some part of the 10 Commandments as well as other things might be a part of it, right? And they said instead, and this is in a decision that was written by the relatively new Chief Justice at that time, Neil Gorsuch, said, well, we should look at history and tradition. Right. So look to the past, look at history and tradition. And this is a major trend in the current Supreme Court. Many of you probably remember in the Dobbs case about abortion choice, right? They said, well, we'll look to history and tradition. Well, I think there are a lot of issues with that. In our history, lots of people didn't have rights. In our history, there were many times there were religious prayers in public schools and so on. So it's kind of saying, well, look to the past. Was it okay, 100 years ago? Well, that's, to me, as a former lawyer, somebody who went to law school, cares about our rights. I think that's a shame. Our rights have really expanded in the last 50 years or so. And now we're saying we're going to look at history and tradition. The dissent by Justice Sonia Sotomayor was a very strong one. And she had a picture of those student football players, praying with the coach. She noted that, and the whole dissenting group noted that some of the students' parents indicated the kids did feel social pressure about all this. And again, Judge Kennedy initially did kind of invite students, and so on. And as she puts it, this case is about whether a public school must permit a school official to kneel, bow his head, and say a prayer at the center of a school event, right? The 50-yard line of a football game. The Constitution doesn't authorize, let alone require public schools to embrace this conduct. And she cites some of those older cases and says, ever since 1962, this court consistently has recognized that school officials leading a prayer is constitutionally impermissible. Well, nonetheless, right now that Kennedy case, definitely does still stand. There also seems to be, and this is not so much a matter of the Supreme Court, but there's have been a shift of allowing public funds to more directly support religious education. And this is through vouchers. It's the parents who send their kids to religious parochial schools in many states, including Wisconsin, can get vouchers that pay for the whole thing. So we all pay, for this whole religious education. Many legal experts see that as a major expansion of support of religious education. And the argument for supporting that taxpayer funding of vouchers for private schools is, well, we're paying for the public schools, so this is just equal support. However, many advocates of separation of church and state would point out, that the vouchers are funding the whole cost of the education. So that includes the books, right? That includes the class materials and so on. So it's very different from just funding transportation. And some of you may even feel that funding the transportation was not okay. And the other thing is that there was an explosion in the growth of parochial religious schools after 1965, right, when the Civil Rights Act passed and said you have to integrate public schools, right? And lots of white parents took their kids out of public schools and sent them to religious parochial schools. So, for example, in Milwaukee, only 3% of Milwaukee public school students are white. 3%. And I didn't go look at how many of the children in Milwaukee are white, but I'm sure it's higher than that, right? Another issue is religious private schools can discriminate. They can discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, right? They have to say they're not doing that if they're going to get these vouchers. They don't have to take those rules off their books. And there are clear examples where it's still happening. For example, one of the articles I read was about a school valedictorian and the head cheerleader, and they were severely punished and told they had to stop their relationship. And that school was getting vouchers. So they stopped their relationship, till the end of school. Hopefully there was no home surveillance going on. All right. Another thing is that the private schools are not held, they're held to lower standards for accommodating kids with disabilities. They have to try to accommodate them, kids with physical disabilities, but the public schools have to do absolutely everything they possibly can, even if it costs a lot of money. They have to really do everything they can. They have a strong legal standard for it. It's lower for the private schools. They don't have to educate special education students at all, but still they're getting this public money, and that's paid for by all of us. So like the more recent Supreme Court decision that I discussed there over religion, these developments about public school voucher funding going to religious schools, I think can also be seen as weakening the separation of church and state. So I think that these developments can certainly be seen, and I think they are an example of kind of making that wall a little more shaky and so on. But the justices who wrote these decisions, and I think the officials who are deciding that vouchers can go to private schools, I think they would still say, well, we believe in the separation of church and state. Then we actually, agree with that, not having establishment. Well, in contrast, Christian nationalism does not pretend to believe in that. It is saying we don't need that. We don't need to separate church and state. We shouldn't do that. No, we should have a Christian nation. I think if you've been watching any media, they're probably aware of this movement, and it has really been growing. I think it started back in the 1950s or so, but it has really mushroomed in recent years. In the words of Dr. Anthea Butler, who has written extensively on Christian nationalism is the belief that America's founding is based on Christian principles. That white Protestant Christianity is the operational religion of the land, and much of Christian nationalism has a strong focus on white people. And then also Christian nationalism believes that Christianity should be the foundation of the nation as it develops its laws, principles, and policies. Christian nationalists believe the U.S. began as a Christian nation. In fact, 60% of Americans actually believe this too. And a strong majority of Republicans believe that, and some Democrats do too. Even though they know it's unconstitutional to have a connection and say, this is a Christian nation. They realize that's unconstitutional. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the people who hold Christian nationalist beliefs, who are influential, and just talk about this influence a little bit. And I really was trying not to sound political, and I usually we really try not to do that. This is a very hard topic to not notice some political distinctions around this. So feel free to talk to me during coffee hour if you want to tell me how I could have done that differently. I'm all ears. But some of the very influential Christian nationalists, well, our current Speaker of the House, right, Representative Mike Johnson, who's third in line to the presidency. He is a strong Christian nationalist. He was part of developing the movement. He taught classes on it. He has called specifically for biblically sanctioned government. Right. Many, if not most, of the January 6th insurrectionists consider themselves Christian nationalists. Many of them had Christian nationalist flags, and they saw themselves as called to engage in this insurrection by their Christian nationalist beliefs. And I can't escape from this. Our own representative in the House of Representatives, Glenn Grothman, has flown the Christian nationalist Appeal to Heaven flag outside of his office. Right outside of his office in the Capitol, a flag that says Appeal to Heaven. Right. And of course, former President Trump espouses Christian national beliefs, although he doesn't actually attend church regularly. And I think his purported religious beliefs seem somewhat less than sincere to me. But he is reaching out to that voter base, right? Some of Trump's allies seem to actually be true believers, like a guy named Russell Voigt. He was the author of part of Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership, which has most of that is about let's consolidate power in the executive and so on. But there are some parts of it that are about Christian nationalism. Russell Voigt, clearly promotes Christian nationalism. He has said if Donald Trump got into office, that he would directly promote Christian nationalism, that he would work on Trump to do that. He would call for a rollback of abortion and birth control rights on a religious basis, and that is actually something that I think President Trump, or ex-President Trump, has said on the campaign trail. And this Russell Voigt believes in restricting immigration to, quote, those who accepted Israel's God, laws, and understanding of history. So have that decide who we're going to let into the country. Well, it's the Christian nationalism is having influence not only in national but in state politics. There's something called Project Blitz that's a Christian nationalist effort to influence state legislation. And this is kind of like ALEC, which was an effort by business groups to get better better laws that were better for big business. This is sort of similar to that. They created a playbook in 2017 that had 20 model bills to introduce in state legislatures in order to infuse religion into public life and government. These include bills mandating or allowing display of the Ten Commandments, and that's despite the Supreme Court decisions that I've mentioned. Right? But there's been a shift in the Supreme Court since those decisions. They also include a religious literacy act that should be taught, a biblical literacy act, and more. Their Licensed Professionals Civil Rights Act would mandate that clergy had to be accepted as counselors in public schools. That's passed and been implemented in Texas. And there are a number of states that have passed this mandate that schools have to post the Ten Commandments in every classroom. And I remember, because I grew up there, that South Dakota is one of them. I think I have the list somewhere here. If I run across it, I'll share that with you. But there are about 7 or 8 schools, and I'm guessing Texas is probably one of them that have passed that. Right. Another part of Christian nationalism is the Seven Mountain Doctrine, and this is saying Christian nationalists should try to affect every aspect of society. That includes business, the arts and entertainment, media, government, family, education, and of course, religion. So what can we, as individuals do, and as Unitarian Universalists, for those of us who are Unitarian Universalists, what can we do as citizens? Well, we can certainly speak out when we have a chance, and we can try to get as educated as we can on these various developments and, on that First Amendment. And I noticed some of you really noticing with Article 6 of the Constitution that says, government officials need to swear an oath of office. They have to do that. And they can never be asked to take a religious test for office, right? And I think people aren't always aware. So being aware and talking to people about that, support and vote for candidates who support the separation of church and state. And I would say also support candidates who would support Supreme Court reform. The Supreme Court, this is not about Christian nationalism, but 2 of the justices on the Supreme Court have very serious ethics violations against them. Congress could say you have to follow an ethics code. We are going to create an ethics code. We're looking into what you're doing. I mean, they could be taken out of office for these things. In the Judiciary Committee, unfortunately, neither of our senators are on the Senate Judiciary Committee. But because of that, I think we'd be fine to contact Senator Dick Durbin, who is the chair of that. I mean, we don't have anybody directly on it, right? He's the chair for everybody in the nation of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I think it would be a good idea to get Supreme Court term limits enacted and so on. That might be something that you could advocate with folks, with representatives and so on. And I think we also really need to support each other in this time. And we need to take courage from our beloved community. And now we'll sing a song that I think is very